They called it wet nursing, a gentle phrase like something tender, nurturing, even holy. But behind those two words was a truth so violent, so unnatural, that even the language was an act of erasure. Because for thousands of enslaved black women in the American South, wet nursing didn't mean feeding a baby out of love. It meant feeding someone else's baby, while their own child, their flesh and blood, cried in hunger just a few feet away. Imagine it. It's the summer of 1842. The air in Georgia is thick with heat, the kind that sticks to your skin like a damp cloth. In the corner of the plantation's nursery, Mary, 23 years old, sits on a wooden rocking chair. Her arms ache from holding the pale, fussing infant of the master's wife. The baby's tiny mouth searches, latches, and begins to drink, not knowing, not caring, that the milk flowing into him was meant for someone else. Mary's own son, Samuel, is less than 2 months old. He is swaddled in rough linen, lying in a cramped cabin across the yard. There, an older enslaved woman tries to hush his cries. Samuel is hungry. His mother's breasts are empty by the time she's allowed to see him. And yet, the plantation doctor calls this good practice. He says white infants are delicate, that they need strong, fresh milk. It is not lost on Mary that what is fresh for this child is starvation for her own. We don't have to imagine all of this, because they wrote it down. In 1845, a Virginia newspaper ran an ad. For hire, healthy young woman, experienced nurse, excellent with white infants. The paper did not mention her name. It did not mention her own child. Slaveholding families openly sought women whose own babies were recently born, because it meant their milk would be plentiful, and plantation owners saw a profit in this. Hiring out enslaved mothers, renting their bodies for the nourishment of white children, sometimes hundreds of miles from their own. This was not an accident. It was an industry. Doctors in the 1800s even wrote manuals about how to choose the ideal wet nurse. One such guide, the Young Mother's Guide by Dr. William Alcott, instructed white women to examine the nurse's teeth, her complexion, even the quality of her milk, as if she were livestock. These guides didn't bother to mention the obvious, that every ounce given to one baby was an ounce stolen from another. In some records, the white mistress would insist the enslaved nurse sleep in the nursery to be available for night feedings, leaving her own baby in the care of someone else. In other cases, the child of the wet nurse would be brought in only when convenient, but convenience for the mistress often meant malnutrition for the child. The cruelty here was layered. It was not just a physical theft of milk. It was a forced emotional bond. Because any mother will tell you, nursing a baby changes you. You learn the rhythm of their breathing, the weight of their small body against yours. And for many enslaved women, those bonds were demanded with the understanding that they were temporary, disposable, and always in service to someone else's bloodline. The Works Progress Administration interviews of the 1930s captured this truth from the mouths of those who lived it. Sarah Gudger, born into slavery in North Carolina, recalled how the nurse women often had to give up their own milk. They put their own babies aside. Them chillin', they cryin' all the time, didn't get strong. Some of them died. Died. That word was not rare in these accounts. Malnutrition was common among the children of wet nurses. Infant mortality was already high under slavery, but for the children of these women, it could be even higher. And the death of a black child on a plantation rarely brought the mourning, the church bells, the solemn burials that white children received. Sometimes, it didn't even bring a proper grave marker. This was not just about feeding babies. This was about power, about control. By dictating whose child was fed, whose child was left to hunger, the slaveholding system reinforced its own hierarchy. It said, our future is worth more than yours. Our children will live. Yours may not. Even the emotional labor was commandeered, because enslaved wet nurses were expected to soothe, rock, and comfort the white child, not just feed it. And this comfort often came at the expense of their own children's needs or their own grief. Some white women even bragged in letters about how their children were spoiled by their black nurses' constant attention. One Southern mistress wrote, in 1851, our little Charles will not go to sleep without Dinah singing. She is quite attached to him, almost as if he were her own. Almost, That almost was everything. By the mid-19th century, this practice was so normalized that entire generations of Southern elites were raised on the milk of enslaved women, while laws and customs worked to erase any acknowledgement of it. White families sometimes took photographs with their black nurse in the background, holding the baby. She might even be in the family portrait, unnamed, standing behind the people she nourished. They could not deny her existence, but they could deny her humanity. And in doing so, they ensured that her story and the story of her own children would be forgotten in the public record. Mary's son Samuel, he did not live to see his first birthday. The plantation ledger simply noted in cramped handwriting, July 18, 1843, boy, age 11 months, deceased. Mother, Mary, nursed the master's child. Cause, unknown. Unknown? No, the cause was known. It was starvation, neglect, and a system designed to treat black motherhood as a resource to be extracted, not a bond to be honored. Mary continued to nurse the master's child for another year. She was given no time to grieve. Her body was too valuable, her milk too precious, but only for someone else's baby. This was wet nursing under slavery. Not a choice, not an act of charity, but a theft, intimate, daily, and devastating. From dawn to dusk, every moment dictated by the needs of another woman's child. And we'll see how this role was weaponized not just for labor, but for the psychological control of an entire people. Imagine waking to the sound of another woman's baby crying, while your own lies silent from hunger. The day began before sunrise. In the dim blue of the quarters, the wet nurse would stir from a restless sleep, her breasts already aching, swollen with milk. Not for her child, but for the one who slept in the big house. She might reach for her own infant first, desperate to give them even a few moments of nourishment before being summoned. But often that wasn't possible. Some were ordered to sleep in the nursery of the white child entirely, never seeing their own until evening. Others lived nearby, but under strict instruction. The master's baby comes first. Records from the diaries of Southern mistresses speak in chillingly casual tones. Martha's milk is plentiful. She must attend to Charles 3 times in the night as well as in the day. Another mistress noted that her servant's own babe was poorly, but still insisted she keep her duties in the nursery lest the child, meaning her own, be spoiled. From the moment she arrived in the nursery, the hierarchy was visible in every detail. The wet nurse might sit in a small rocker, the white infant swaddled in fine linen. The smell of lye soap and boiled cotton lingered in the air, the nursery warmed by a fireplace even in mild weather. She would bring the child to her breast. The baby would latch instinctively, drawing down her milk. And as the minutes passed, the ache in her body eased, even as the ache in her heart deepened, because with every swallow, she knew her own child, somewhere nearby, was going without. Her duties didn't end with feeding. Many wet nurses were also the baby's primary caretaker, bathing, rocking, and tending to their every need. Diaries and plantation logs show how often these women became de facto mothers to the children they nursed. Some grew attached, despite themselves. Others held back, guarding their hearts from a bond they never asked for. Because one day, when the baby was weaned or the family moved, that bond would be severed without ceremony. In between feeds, she might be sent back to field work or house chores, milking cows, scrubbing floors, mending clothes. But she was always expected to be ready at a moment's notice if the baby cried. At night, the routine repeated. Some wet nurses slept on a pallet in the nursery, awakened every few hours. Others were roused from their own beds in the quarters. And in those midnight hours, the cruelty deepened, because she might hear her own child's thin wail from a nearby room, unanswered. One formerly enslaved woman, interviewed in the 1930s, recalled, "They give my baby to an old woman to feed from a spoon while I nursed the white one. My baby cried all the time, and I had to pretend I did not hear." Medically, the toll was immense. Lactation demands calories, rest, and hydration, none of which were consistently provided. Many wet nurses reported dizziness, exhaustion, and chronic breast infections. Infant mortality for their own children was disproportionately high. in part because of the lack of maternal milk. But there was also the psychological fracture, a constant tearing between the instinct to nurture and the command to serve. It was motherhood, inverted, by the time her own child finally received her breast. Often late at night, when the day's work was done, the milk might be diminished, the child too weak or too hungry to nurse well. And yet, this wasn't an accident of circumstance. It was a design system, one that made white children dependent on black women's bodies while teaching those women that even their most intimate biological functions were not their own. Behind the personal stories lay cold economic reasoning. Enslaved women were chosen as wet nurses because it allowed white mothers, particularly those of high status, to avoid the physical toll of nursing themselves. It also reinforced social distance. A white woman's time was too valuable, her body too delicate for such labor. And on plantations, every choice that increased the productivity of the white household, even if it starved black infants, was seen as rational business. Letters between plantation owners reveal the calculated nature of these arrangements. Sally's babe died last winter, which frees her for service to Margaret's boy. This will allow us to reassign one maid from the nursery to the kitchens. This was not care. It was extraction, a transfer of life, one mouth to another, dictated by the needs of power. By the end of each day, the wet nurse was drained in every sense of the word, body emptied of milk, heart emptied of choice. And yet the cycle will begin again with the next dawn. They say chains clink when you walk, but there were chains in slavery that made no sound at all. The chains that bound a wet nurse were not made of iron. They were made of expectation, control, and unspoken, unending demand. Even after the baby she was assigned to feed had grown old enough for solid food, the white family found ways to keep her under their thumb. She had proven herself valuable. And in slavery, value was a dangerous word. Value meant you could never leave. Value meant your body was now a living asset, something they'd account for like furniture or livestock. And so, many women remained trapped in the cycle of serving another's household, sometimes until their own youth faded, their bodies worn thin from decades of giving life to someone else's children. But perhaps the most insidious chain was psychological. These women had been forced into such proximity with their oppressors' children that lines blurred in cruel ways. The babies they fed often grew attached to them, clinging to them in times of fear, calling them mama before they ever spoke their own mother's name. For the white child, this bond was innocent. For the black woman, it was a wound that never fully healed, because every moment of tenderness, every smile from that child, was stolen from the one who should have received it, her own. Some wet nurses spoke later, in rare moments of safety, about the split inside their hearts, how they'd rock a white child to sleep while imagining their own baby's face, wondering if their little one was crying somewhere across the plantation, hungry, alone, reaching out for a mother who wasn't allowed to come. And over years, something even more cruel took root, guilt. Because when you hold any child, even one forced into your arms, you can't help but care for them, at least a little. That's human nature. And so the wet nurse learned to love the baby she was feeding, while hating the world that had taken hers away. It was a form of emotional captivity, one that ensured her loyalty without a whip. But make no mistake, when that child grew up, the dynamic shifted. The white boy or girl who had once clung to her skirts would learn, often from their own parents, that this woman they had called mama was not a mama at all, that she was the help, that her love, her milk, her care, all of it was part of a transaction they never paid for. And here's the most chilling part. Many white families later rewrote the story entirely. They'd tell future generations how their ancestors were kind to their slaves because they let them nurse their babies, as if it had been a gift granted to the black woman, rather than a theft committed against her. The reality? The wet nurse was not a cherished nanny. She was a survival tool. Her milk was as much a commodity as cotton. And in the ledgers of slavery, nothing, not even the milk of a mother, escaped being measured, claimed, and controlled. The invisible chain stretched far beyond the plantation. Even after slavery ended, some of these women found themselves still in service, still nursing children who were not their own, still locked in the same cycle, only now in the guise of employment, freedom, it seemed, had its own fine print. And in the North, where slavery had been abolished earlier, the story wasn't much better. Wealthy white families hired black women as wet nurses well into the late 1800s, still separating them from their own children for weeks or months at a time. The pay was meager, the hours endless, and the emotional toll unrecorded but deeply felt. The practice left scars that never made it into history books. Because history, as it's usually told, wasn't written for them. They say history echoes. But sometimes it doesn't echo like a song, it haunts like a ghost. The mothers who were forced into wet nursing didn't just lose time with their babies. They lost the ability to form the kind of bonds that protect and shape a child's life. And the children, both black and white, were shaped by that unnatural exchange in ways no one wanted to talk about. The white children nursed at their breasts grew up believing, from their first memories, that the nourishment of a black woman's body was theirs by right. It was intimacy without equality, dependence without respect. Some of those same children would grow into men who owned the next generation of enslaved people and never once questioned the humanity of the women who had fed them from their own bodies. Meanwhile, the black children left hungry in slave cabins learned a different lesson, that their mothers could be taken from them at any moment, for any reason, that they would have to share the most primal bond in life, the bond between mother and child, with the people who saw them as property. Imagine the emotional fracture that caused a fracture passed down not in blood, but in silence. Even after emancipation, wet nursing didn't vanish overnight. Poverty, lack of opportunity, and systemic racism meant many black women continued to nurse white children as a form of employment well into the 20th century. Some did it for survival, others because there were no other options. And though they were paid, the imbalance of power remained. The history lingered in the room with every feeding. And here's the truth nobody likes to say out loud. The idea of taking the most intimate act of motherhood from black women was not an accident. It was part of the machinery. A machinery built to strip black motherhood of autonomy and dignity, to turn even the sacred into labor for someone else's benefit. Today, the legacy of that system shows up in subtle but devastating ways. Studies reveal that black mothers in America are still far more likely to face barriers to breastfeeding, from lack of workplace support to the ongoing stigma tied to a history many have never been told. Hospitals in black communities are less likely to provide lactation consultants. Maternity wards serving majority black populations are less likely to follow practices that support mother-infant bonding in the critical first hours. And while these may seem like modern healthcare issues, the shadow of wet nursing is there. Because when a culture spends centuries severing black mothers from their infants for someone else's gain, it leaves scars on the system itself. But there's another side to this story, one they didn't plan for. Because black motherhood, despite everything, endured. It endured in the whispered lullabies sung at night when the overseer couldn't hear. It endured in the way mothers found hidden moments to nurse their own babies, even if it meant risking punishment. It endured in the community of women who helped raise and feed each other's children when a mother was forced away. And now, more black mothers are reclaiming that space. There are movements dedicated to rewriting the narrative, to making breastfeeding support a cultural priority, and to telling the truth about the history that shaped it. Because this is not just a story about loss. It's a story about survival. And survival always carries with it the seed of resistance. Somewhere deep in the archives, there are photographs of black women holding white babies in their arms, their eyes fixed not on the child, but on the horizon. They are a reminder that even in service, even in bondage, their spirit wasn't owned. So when we tell this story, the real story of wet nursing, we are not just exposing a hidden cruelty. We are honoring the women who lived through it, the women who, despite being denied the fullness of their own motherhood, still found ways to pass on love, resilience, and life itself. Because milk can be taken, time can be stolen, but the will to nurture, to protect, to survive, that is something no system, no empire, no master has ever truly owned. And that is the part of the story they could never erase. Stories like this were never meant to be told. They were buried, hidden between the pages of history books, erased from the memories of generations. But every time we speak them aloud, every time we pass them on, we take back what was stolen. If this story moved you, If it made you think, feel, or question what you were taught, don't let it end here. Share it. Tell someone else. Be the reason another mind wakes up to the truth. And if you want more untold stories of resilience, brilliance, and the fight for dignity, subscribe now. Because the more of us who know, the harder it becomes for history to be erased again. This is more than just a channel. It's a movement. And movements grow when we move together.